Good evening, everybody. It's Steve with the Real Progressives, and we've got a great show for you tonight. We're going to be exploring, many of the questions you guys have had for us have all been about, so why do you keep saying taxes don't quote unquote fund spending? And why are you so concerned about economics and so forth? And what we're going to do tonight, we're going to take a step away from maybe some of the more rote economic, back and forth in terms of academic studies and in terms of some of the jargon. And we're going to get to the policy space that many of the progressives in this community are just unaware that we can do. And so Joe has gone through the process of putting together an overall strategy for real progressives to consider embarking on as we look at our next leaders and what we should demand from them. This is not just economics, folks. This is the policy space that represents a fiscal strategy. So with no further ado, let me bring on my guest. Welcome, Joe Firestone. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Steve. How are you?
I'm very good. So talk to us, Joe. We're in a position now where we're told that everything that matters to us is too expensive. It's pie in the sky. Many people think, hey, we should just unite because we're angry at Trump. But there's a whole lot of policy space here that we really kind of come to grips with so that we as a unit know what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. So this is why this topic is so beautiful to me. And with no further ado, go ahead, sir. Break it down for us.
Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the very point you just made, which is the importance of running on something that is positive. The importance of saying what we want to accomplish. Okay, and even if we're primarily about criticizing Trump, what we still need to do is not just talking about all the bad things that Trump is guilty of. We need to begin to think about how our own program would compare to what Trump seems to be doing and what he intends. And that's very, very important. So what kind of positive program should we follow? And you might also think about how does that policy program differ from some of the other political actors around, such as not just the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party as well, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and some of the other actors in the system, okay, at this point. Now, in previous sessions, either myself, or Ellis Winningham have talked about the public purpose, okay, and what it means. And I've outlined in something I wrote, okay, and was posted up in our group, 33 dimensions of public purpose. Now, these 33 dimensions, okay, of public purpose weren't all about fiscal policy. They weren't even all about the combination of fiscal policy and trade policy. They were about many, many broader issues. What we're going to focus on here tonight, though, is a fiscal policy agenda. Okay, and it will be a fiscal policy agenda that I think is in accord with public purpose. That is consistent with and supports the dimensions of public purpose, which I outlined in some of our previous programs and in my paper. Okay, so here we go with fiscal policy agenda. The first item on it is that we ought to be for a full payroll tax holiday. That would immediately put a significant infusion into the economy the very week after it was enacted. So it takes almost no time to put into effect, and that's one of the beauties of it. Okay, here's what it would do for a couple earning $50,000 each. Okay, that is a working couple, earning $50,000 each. That would produce a tax credit for them annually of 600. I'm sorry, I believe it's $650 a month.
Wow.
Okay. In any case, that's quite an infusion into the economy. Now, this could be structured so that it's done automatically whenever the economy turns down.
An automatic stabilizer.
An automatic stabilizer. It doesn't have to be a complete tax cut, both for the employee and the employer each time, because when the economy starts to turn down, there may not be the space for further spending, okay, than there is when we're in a period like we were in 2008. So what you might want to do with the automatic stabilizer is to gradually introduce it. As the economy starts to turn down, you might want to back off the tax cut from 13%. In other words, from what is it now? 14% split up, okay, between the employer and the employee. Okay, so instead of cutting the 13% involved there, or the 14% involved there, I forget what the figure is exactly, but I'm sure someone will be able to supply it. One might start with 1% for the employer and 1% for the employee, just to give a little infusion, okay? And then it might also be scheduled, well, if the economy still turns down further, then you move up to 2%, then you move up to 3%, okay? And if it's really falling, then you just introduce the full 6.5% or so on each side, the employer and the employee side, to inject that stimulus into the economy. As the economy recovers, you could gradually back off the stimulus until you finally get to the point where the tax is automatically reimposed as the economy is reaching the full employment state. Now, such infusions into the economy, we know, have a fiscal multiplier, a primary fiscal multiplier, which is $1.30 for each dollar the federal government supplies to the economy.
Can we explain that for a second, Joe?
Yes, I'll explain that. When the federal government puts $1 into the private sector, that adds $1 to GDP. Okay, if there's a multiplier of 1.3 on that, that means that for that particular type of expenditure, it adds $1.30 as a primary fiscal multiplier. Now we say a primary fiscal multiplier to GDP, okay, because once the new money starts to circulate into the economy, there are waves of multipliers. There's a secondary fiscal multiplier. There's a tertiary fiscal multiplier. With a primary fiscal multiplier of 1.3 for each dollar put into the economy, you might actually end up with a total multiplier, taking account all of the waves of multiplication here, of $2.10 for the $1 which the federal government has put into the economy through a payroll tax holiday. Now, not all expenditures have that kind of multiplier. For example, Bush's tax cuts for the wealthy, okay, in the early days of the 2000s, only produced a fiscal multiplier of 30 cents, a primary multiplier, okay, of 30 cents. So I'm not talking about $1.30 there. I'm saying for each money that was for each dollar that was injected by the federal government into the economy, what actually got added in the end, because of what the rich did with the money, which was primarily to sock it away and take it out of the economy again, only 30 cents actually got into the economy. So, of course, there's a big difference in the primary multiplier if one is putting in $1.30 as opposed to 30 cents. Now, these multipliers vary across the board. For example, something like an unemployment insurance payment has a multiplier which I believe is roughly in the range of $1.70. Infrastructure spending, once it gets going, is also very high. That might have a multiplier of somewhere around $1.60 or something like that. Okay, so there are measures you can take that have a higher multiplier than a Social Security tax cut. Okay, but they will not take effect quite as fast. Okay, the Social Security tax cut can take effect the first week. Okay, simply because the money is no longer withdrawn from the pay of the employees. Okay, and is no longer paid into a deposit account by the employers, including their contribution. So it can have an immediate effect, and that's why it's particularly effective. Now, when you do a full payroll tax holiday, it should be done so that the federal government pays back the costs to the trust fund of any failure to raise taxes, so-called. In other words, to get the FICA contributions. Okay, since the federal government won't be getting those FICA contributions, okay, then that would normally be cause a marking down of the trust fund. But in this case, the funds for the tax cut would be made up out of general revenue, so that the Social Security trust fund, so-called, would not be marked down as a result of.
Let me catch you just for a second so we don't confuse our audience for things that we've said in the past. We basically told them Social Security can't go broke. The trust fund is merely just a ledger. It's not like any kind of piggy bank somewhere with old crumpled up dollar bills from Granny from 1936. I want to make sure people don't think we're actually funding things in the sense of like, oh my God, if I don't pay a tax dollar, we can't have Social Security. It's going to go broke. I think the terminology for some of the newer non-econ people might be a little difficult, and I just wanted to make sure that we clear that up so that they understand what you're saying. We're talking about ledger work. We're talking about keystroke work. We're not talking about like some, treasury fund over here that's lockboxed and all the other nonsense misnomers that they use to scare us.
We're not actually talking about a running out of money. What we're talking about is a political situation. In other words, everybody's going to be watching the trust fund. And the conservatives and the austerity people are going to be screaming. If you put through a payroll tax holiday, and that causes $650 billion annually to be spent on the tax holiday, then the conservatives are going to be screaming about how the trust fund was robbed of $650 billion. Now, that actually never happened because there wasn't $650 billion in the trust fund. There were only some numbers in a ledger, okay? But from the political standpoint, it's valuable to have a provision there that says, okay, when we do this tax holiday, we're not going to be marking down the trust fund. So that's not a political issue, okay? And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about doing something cosmetic so the political issue doesn't raise its head when we do the payroll tax holiday, okay?
Very good.
So the estimated cost of the program would be $650 billion annually. But if you do it in the way I suggested, the full payroll tax holiday may not be in effect for a year. I mean, it might be in effect for 2 or 3 months, and then it might be gradually eased over a period of time. So it might, very well be that in a given year, it would actually cost only $325 billion, or only $400 billion, or only $200 billion. Depends on how fast the economy recovers from what looks like it's going to be a fall into a serious recession. Okay? But if it lasted for a year, it would cost $650 billion. Okay, so the second program on the agenda, a state revenue sharing program.
Amen.
During the crash of 2007, and 2008, suddenly the state governments were left without any money. I shouldn't say without any money. They had some money, but there were immense shortfalls because tax revenues at the state level started falling very, very rapidly. So the state governments cut employees and they cut services and they denied real services to people because they couldn't afford to pay for the real services anymore and to pay for the personnel. So the teachers got cut. Fire protection services got cut. Police forces got cut. All kinds of important services to the public were cut at the state level because of the fallout from the crash of 2008. Okay, and over a period of time, those positions have never come back, and those services have been starved. Has anyone gone to a DMV these days?
Actually,
I mean, you could sit there for hours and hours and hours because they don't have the personnel to handle you. Back in 2007 and 2006, it was fine. They closed offices all over the place. So essentially what they did is they placed a tax on our time. We had to take time off from work. Everybody who needed a driver's license or needed other licenses or was selling a car had to take time off from work to go to these places where the service was entirely inadequate because of the cuts, the personnel. Class sizes rose in schools because teachers who were retired were never replaced because staffs were cut down. So these services really suffered at the state level. What I'm saying here is it would be great for the economy and great for services and great for public purpose if $1,000 per person one-time grant to the states was made to give the economy a boost, to help to create a full employment situation. The cost for that on an annual basis would be $325 billion. There are 325 million people in the United States right now. If it's $1,000 a person, it's $325 billion. Now, since these are state-level jobs and these are middle-class people, they're going to save more, generally speaking, than the Social Security recipients might. And so the multiplier is going to be a little less. I estimated it. I don't have a figure for this, but I estimated that the primary fiscal multiplier is, I shouldn't even call it an estimate. I guessed that the primary fiscal multiplier would be $1.20 for people like policemen and firemen, and teachers, plumbers, various people who are working for the state and who are employed by the state to perform services. So if the primary multiplier, okay, is $1.20, then maybe when you get through with all the multipliers, you're up around $1.95 or $2 per federal dollar spent on this. Still a very worthwhile federal expenditure, unlike the tax cuts for the wealthy, which Mr. Bush put into effect and which Mr. Trump is preparing to double down on right now. Okay. A much, much better expenditure of federal funds. And the third policy I want to talk about in the policy agenda is the federal job guarantee, the MMT job guarantee. It would be federally funded. It should be implemented through deficit spending. I think it's one of those things we can always put on, deficit spending. It would employ people who haven't been able to find full-time jobs at a living wage in this economy. Depending upon the statistic that you're looking at, we still have 18, 19, 20, perhaps 25 million people who are in this particular situation. A good many of them have dropped out of the official labor force because it isn't worth it for them to go to work in terms of the cost of living. They're better off simply going into the underground economy or sitting home and not spending money. So they have less money they have to spend in order to subsist. And maybe they can, succeed in living off the charity of various charitable agencies, and relatives. So there may be 25 million such people now if we look at things like the statistics, of disemployment that were computed steadily through 2013, 2014 by one blogger named Hugh, who remassaged the BLS statistics each month to try to find all of the hidden people, and always came out with figures that were 5 to 7 million people higher than the U6 unemployment figures, which didn't really get at the people who had completely left the labor force. So, again, this should be federally funded, with deficit spending. It should be a full-time job offer, if one wants that, at a living wage. It's intended as a transitional job. It's not a permanent job. But it would have full fringe benefits, including enhanced Medicare for all, if that is necessary. The reason why it might not be necessary is because another point in the program is to pass an enhanced Medicare for all for everybody. And if one is successful at, doing that, then obviously that fringe benefit would no longer be needed for the job guarantee program. So that's why I said, if necessary. Now, the job guarantee does not replace any other federal program or current federal jobs. They would still remain in place, and most of them carry salaries considerably over the minimum federal wage. And so they would still be carrying salaries that would be above the living wage from the job guarantee program, which I'll shortly talk about. These would be jobs of great social and community value. They might, in most cases perhaps, be green jobs. They would be structured with the assistance of local governments, community nonprofits, and the participants themselves who had registered for the job guarantee program. So they would be jobs that all parties concerned thought were of social and community value. Jobs worth doing, jobs that people could get satisfaction out of. Now, what would be the job guarantee wage and the impact, the likely impact short term of the job guarantee? Well, first, let us say, for example, the living wage might be $15 per hour. That ought to be cost adjusted across the nation by the Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area, SMSA, CPI index, so that it might be less than $15 an hour in certain really low-cost areas. It might come in at $12 an hour in terms of the cost adjustment. But in places like New York City, it might come in at $26 per hour. Okay. Now, even though we're talking numbers, what you have to do here is to focus on the principles that are involved, because we can argue over the numbers. Some people might say, well, $15 an hour isn't really enough. That's not yet a living wage. We think it should be $18 an hour. Well, these are things to be debated, okay, and to be worked out. And maybe it is $18 an hour. I don't know. It might be that in the median community inside the United States, a living wage is $18 an hour. If that's the case, the basis for the cost adjustment should be the $18 per hour, okay, and not the $15 per hour. So I'm not wedded to $15 an hour. There's no particular reason why I should be, okay? We work out through political conflicts and hopefully through a modicum of rational thought what the right number is, okay? I'm proposing $15 an hour. Now, one of the impacts, of course, would be that everybody who wants to be employed would be employed, either fully employed, or if they want to be part-time employed, they could be part-time employed, okay? That would be up to them and up to how the communities and the local government structure the job guarantee program. In other words, this would not be a federal bureaucracy here. What would happen is that there would be grants made to the local communities who would be administering this program, okay, to work with the nonprofits, okay, and work with the community groups to structure the particular programs, okay. The checks involved, the $15 an hour involved, or the $26 an hour involved, would, however, be paid directly to the participants so that there could be no skimming off by the local community officials or by the nonprofits, okay, or by anybody else. The monies involved for the hours work would go directly to the individuals involved. Now, so that's a very, very positive impact. Of course, it would lift an economy which was the slightest bit down. The numbers of people who were in the job guarantee program would also fluctuate depending on the economy. As the economy starts to roar, members of the job guarantee program would be hired away by the private sector. All they have to do to hire them away is to offer fringe benefits that are just as good and living wages that are better, okay? And so they would have to bring up their standard of pay and compensation of workers to match the job guarantee, okay? So
real quickly, Joe, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
A general increase,
Joe, can you hear me?
Of equality in the population because of the lifting mechanism of the job guarantee at first.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. You were a little blurred, but I can hear you.
Oh, okay. We had a question. I was just trying to get you to pause for a second. He says, what's to prevent gouging in low-income areas to increase payouts? And I don't quite fully understand what he's saying there, but I wanted to ask you if you could make heads or tails of that.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Okay, I didn't get the question.
Okay, he said, what is to prevent gouging in the low-income areas to increase payouts? I don't know what he completely means there, but I'm giving it a shot.
Yes, I'm not sure I know what he means. I don't see where the gouging could take place because the money for the jobs is getting paid directly to the individuals. Now, there are overhead costs for expenses and things like that.
He's saying Kansas versus New York.
Kansas versus New York.
Yeah, I don't fully understand.
I'm not sure I understand the question. When we understand the question, we will try to answer it.
Okay, keep going, Joe.
So, one of the main objections here is that the impact would be severe on retail businesses that are now paying, generally speaking, way less than the $15 an hour of the job guarantee. Okay, in many cases, notorious retail businesses, such as the Walmarts of the world and the Targets of the world, to a lesser extent, okay, and many other chain stores, now paying maybe $8.50, $9, or $10 an hour, would find themselves with a 50% increase or more in their wage bill extremely quickly. And they would not like that because at first it would come out of their profits. Might increase sales, but at least at first, okay, it would come out of their profits. And so they would not like that because they're going to get a profit hit. Some small retail businesses might get such a severe hit that they would not be able to stay in business. Okay, so the question really is, well, what do I say about that? I mean, what I say is many businesses now are not paying a living wage to workers. Insofar as they are not, they are exploiting the workers, and they're also forcing workers to turn to local governments and to state governments and to the federal governments for supplementary benefits, okay, of various kinds, because the employers are not paying the living wage to them. So in effect, right now, the governments are indirectly subsidizing the profits of the employers who don't want to pay a living wage to their workers, but who have the understanding that their workers will actually be living on more because governments will be supplementing their wages so they can continue to afford to come to work. So it's not a particularly happy situation when our governments, instead of devoting themselves to public purpose, are subsidizing the Walmarts of the world and the Walmart family of the world so that they can increase their fortunes from $40 billion and $30 billion to $60 billion and $70 billion and so on ad infinitum. I don't think that's a public purpose, okay, of government. You can raise the question even whether businesses who are hiring employees, okay, at wages lower than a living wage actually deserve to exist. My only answer to that question is it depends really on the social purpose and the social contributions of those businesses. If they have few social functions, okay, but only economic ones that could be performed by other people, then, okay, or by other companies, then they are the source, or one of the sources of a great deal of inequality in our society. And if they had to shut down, then it would probably be a good thing for us. However, if there are companies that pay a substandard wage, but that are performing very important social functions, like, let's say, the Salvation Army, okay, and the Goodwill of the World, okay, and those kinds of organizations, then they could apply to local communities for subsidies from the JG program, okay, the Job Guarantee program, so that they could continue to stay in business. In other words, they would basically be getting a supplementation of the wage, but so as to avoid the raking off, okay, of profits that might happen in this situation, then one might arrange for the supplementation of the paychecks to go directly to the employees involved, okay, and not to go to the employers of such companies. So the subsidies could still be given, but they would be explicit subsidies, and they would be given to the employees themselves in businesses that could claim social value and that were recognized by the local governments as having social value. Okay. So what would be the cost, okay, of this program? Well, let's say you were even in a very bad time when there were 10 million people that had to go into this particular program. And that when you counted the overhead on the employees involved, one gets to figure something like this. $15 an hour for roughly 2,000 hours a year is roughly $30,000 a year. Okay, if there's an overhead cost of 50% on the 30,000, that comes to $45,000 for each of the employees in the program. Okay. Now, so per year, that's going to produce something between federal spending of $450 billion to $500 billion going into the economy, providing people jobs, very high multiplier expenditures. In other words, multipliers, primary fiscal multipliers, getting into the $1 range. Okay, so that would be happening. Now, with that measure and some of the others we've talked about, the recession that we're talking about would not be very long for this world. The uptick would begin in a very, very time. When it did, people would begin to move out of the job guarantee. So over a year's time, perhaps, the amount of people in the job guarantee might shrink from 10 million to 2.5 million or something like that. So the bottom line is, instead of $100 billion annual cost for the program in those conditions, you're looking at something like a $250 billion to $300 billion annual cost for the program. Now, why am I talking about the cost of these programs at all when we know the federal government has no solvency problems? The reason is because the federal government can have inflation problems. And we'll talk about those some later, but since it could have inflation problems, then it will have real constraints upon it. And it may have much greater policy space than it has now. but it will still have constraints on its policy space. And so we're going to have to ask the question at some point, well, how much policy space do we really have to do all this? And we'll talk about that, okay, a little bit later.
Give me 1 second, Joe, before you go any further, because I deal with these individuals like day in and day out. And these are the fears that the Austrians and the LOL Libertarians and the Vote Blue sycophants and the Republicans say to them all the time, what about inflation? What about inflation? And I want them to understand that while you're going to talk about what those real restraints are, constraints are, it's not even constraints. It's like, what is our threshold for inflation? What are we happy with? Because not all inflation is bad. So the question is, at what point in time do we hit our target? Are we happy with where it's at? And I want people to not be afraid, because there's so much fear porn out there, Joe, that people can't even hear anything but there could be inflation, and they go, what? What? What do you mean that? What do you mean? So can you just clarify real quickly where we're going with that? And we can define it later. But I just want to make sure that we dispel the fear mongering that has been instilled in people's heads to the point where we don't ask for anything better.
Okay, well, when we say we have space, when we have policy space, the reason why we say that, okay, is because when government spends in the economy over, say, a year's period, okay, there are a lot of things going on. Some of those things involve the private sector and the foreign sector of the economy withdrawing money from the private sector economy. In other words, when the private sector trades for foreign goods and pays American dollars for the foreign goods, it's moving money outside of the U.S. Economy, where it's not available to contribute to demand. So if that amounts to 6% of GDP, there's 6% of GDP going out of the U.S. economy. When people decide that come what may, they're going to move heaven and earth to save 3% of their income. And so they determine that they're not going to spend. Then that removes demand from the economy too, and in fact causes downturns in the economy. So since money is leaving the economy all the time, if the government doesn't compensate for the net financial assets actually leaving the economy and not contributing to the economy, then you're going to have increases. You'll have decreasing sales, increases, okay, in unemployment, and further reductions in spending and demand. And that's how recessionary spirals start, and that's how they continue. So the economy is not stable by itself. It only stays stable if the government compensates for the leakages in the economy. Now, the amount it has to spend, okay, in order to counteract these leakages to the economy is what defines the policy space. As long as that policy space exists, as long as it's there, demand pull inflation cannot happen. Now,
define demand pull inflation, please, for the people that don't know these terms. Can you define that real quickly?
Okay, that is inflation caused by the fact that the public wants to spend too much money relative to the productive capacity of the economy to supply the goods and services which the public is asking for with its money. So until we've reached that point, we've still got policy space for government spending. Okay? How do we know when we reach that point? Well, we know when we reach that point, when we see prices begin to go up fairly rapidly, and we don't see any signs of specialized, specific supply bottlenecks that are caused by segments of the market where the market, is broken. And so theoretically, it should be able to supply everything that's needed, but it can't supply it. And the demand for those goods and services is too great. And so the producers cannot meet the demand by increasing employment anymore because everybody's working. There's full employment. And the only thing that they can do in order to satisfy the demand is lower the demand by raising prices, which is what they do. And then that's where the inflation comes in, when they're forced to raise prices rather than increase production. So that's demand pull inflation.
Very good.
Supply push inflation is where, in particular sectors of the economy, the willingness of some group of companies that are dominating an economy to supply necessary goods and services, is very low, and because of the lack of competition in that particular sector, they don't have to fulfill the demand. They can artificially raise prices because of their control over supply. So that is not inflation being caused by government spending. That is inflation which is being caused by the control of the supply that these few producers have. As, for example, in the famous oil price inflations of the 70s, OPEC at first and the Saudis later were controlling the supply of oil, the world supply, of oil. And so they kept raising the price. The United States had lost control of the supply of oil. What finally broke that inflation was not the Federal Reserve with its raising interest rates, to ridiculous heights based on the assumption that they were facing a demand pull inflation. It was the fact that Jimmy Carter deregulated the natural gas industry. And in that way, he got them to look for new supplies, of natural gas. Unfortunately, it did not begin to loosen supply until the early 80s when Ronald Reagan was already in power. So Reagan benefited from Carter's change in policy. But in a delayed fashion, it was actually Carter who broke the supply push inflation of the 1970s that everybody supposed was actually a demand pull inflation, and so used the wrong measures to try to fight it, thereby causing what was called stagflation, at that time, which is a condition of high unemployment and high inflation all at the same time.
Okay, Joe, we have a question from the audience that I wanted to read up to you, and I think it is very, very important to everything that we've been talking about. Catherine says, it goes deeper than that. These people have accumulated 50 to 100 grand in interest over the past decade on existing student loans. There really is no incentive to make any more than minimum need. Everything made over certain numbers gets taxed and taken away from student loan debt. And if amount doesn't even reduce the principal of the debt or barely makes a dent, you realize one thing, you're screwed. And then there is no point in fighting. Position defensively, own nothing, make little, spend little, live your life as best you can, knowing you will never ever crawl out of debt knowing you will never own a home, maybe even never have a family, etc. And so,
Okay.
the point.
Okay, I'd like to quickly answer this. Okay, at this
Sure.
point, by saying, I'm going through a policy agenda. In one of the items of the policy agenda coming up soon, I'm going to address student loan debt, and I'm going to address it very vigorously. Okay? And
Amen.
with this policy agenda, okay, if we could implement it, it would get rid of student loan debt.
Beautiful.
Period. End of story. A debt jubilee. That's coming up as part of this policy agenda. Okay?
Excellent.
With much more besides. Okay.
Keep going, Joe.
Okay. So here's another item within the policy agenda. Okay, this is something I would really like to see. I would like to replace the entitlement trust funds, quote unquote, and expand entitlement payments by providing for automatic annual funding for Social Security and for Medicare payments, okay, and for other payments that now come out of the trust fund. My argument for this is based on FDR's Economic Bill of Rights. Okay, now FDR is probably best known in relation to entitlements by the arguments he gave in the 1930s for establishing the trust fund in the first place, okay, the trust funds in the first place. And what he said then is that when people pay into Social Security, yeah, we know they don't really have to pay into Social Security to fund Social Security, but when they pay into Social Security, then nobody's going to dare take it away from them, simply because they'll always be able to say, well, we earned it and we paid for it, and therefore it's rightfully ours and we are entitled to it. And in the 30s, he pointed out that that was a very strong argument. And given the value system of the 1930s, it probably was a very strong argument, okay, at that time. And it served Social Security well right up until the 1980s, okay? But from the 1980s till now, that argument has encountered a struggle. Now, what FDR is also famous for, but the meaning of which people maybe don't think through, was his Economic Bill of Rights, which he propounded during the Second World War. And that specified a right for everyone to have good medical care and a decent and dignified retirement. And he propounded this then as a human right for Americans. And it was something he wanted to work on after the Second World War and would have worked on, but unfortunately he died too soon. This right is not based on what has been paid in, and it's not a matter of earning the benefits. It's that these benefits are an inalienable right of Americans. They are a true entitlement, a new human right for retired Americans, okay, and for other Americans like the disabled, and everybody who has a right to decent health care, to quality health care. I want to see that right acknowledged by the federal government. I'd love to see it placed in the Constitution, but failing that, I'd like very, very strong legislative guarantees of these rights, and then the payments automatically approved each year to come out of the general revenues, as, for example, the drug benefits that Bush passed in 2004 are funded this way through an automatic renewal each year. I want to see that extended to all of our entitlement programs. I want to see them therefore become true entitlements. And in terms of expansion, I would like to see retirement payouts be doubled along with our disability payments. Why doubled? Because the payouts that exist right now on these programs are only about half of what other advanced nations over are paying out to their citizens right now. I believe that if other countries can afford to do that for their citizens, the United States of America can also afford to do it for our citizens. We are certainly no poorer than the countries in Europe that are doing this right now. So, next, fix the health insurance system. To me, that means pass enhanced Medicare for all. What's enhanced Medicare for all? No copays, no deductibles, all services and products to be available free at the point of service. All basic services covered, including mental health care, chiropractic, dental services, and all materials and products. Okay. In my view, that should also include contraception and abortion services. Yes, there's going to be a battle royale over those kinds of things. We go into the battle, we get what we can, we ask for everything, we compromise if we absolutely have to compromise, but not before. We don't pre-compromise. We fight for these things because they are rights. How do we get this concretely? Every year, John Conyers, who's a representative from the Detroit area in Michigan, introduces H.R. 676 into the Congress. I believe he's introduced the 2017 version right now. But he has funding measures in his bill because he's trying to make it, or was trying to make it, a fiscally neutral bill for reasons you're all already familiar with. I don't care whether it's fiscally neutral or not. So I don't even want to talk about how it's going to be funded. What I want is for funding for it to be automatically approved on a continuing basis each year because it's one of the entitlements. So from my point of view, you go into H.R. 676, you cut out all the funding provisions, forget them, just look at the benefit provisions. And the benefit provisions provide for no copays, no deductibles, services and products, all available free at the point of service and covering all the basic services that I just defined. How much would that cost? Well, it would probably cost about $800 billion a year more for the federal government than the federal government is now paying with its own expenditures for health care and its aid to the states and all this business. If you wrap it all into a bundle, it probably now costs about $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion or so. I want the federal government to spend $800 billion more than it's spending now to replace all these other expenditures. Okay, I don't care whether the $800 billion is deficit spent or not. That's a consideration for people concerned with inflation to take up as to whether there should be taxes attached to it or not, or whether the taxes should come out of another pot, or just what should be done about the taxes. If you wanted a stimulus, further stimulus, for the economy, this would be a great stimulus each year. $800 billion more. Okay, would be great. But let us be clear about one thing. Right now, our medical care costs that the federal government is paying out are fiscally neutral. They're covered by the trust funds. Okay, so people have paid in, so-called, to the trust funds, and so credits used to pay for these things involve a marking down of the trust funds. So now they don't involve any deficit spending. So, okay, it's estimated that if we have a Medicare for All program, just as efficient as the Canadian one, which is a very, very good program indeed, with higher life expectancy and better health outcomes than we generally have in this country. They spend roughly 2/3 of what we do as a percent of GDP on healthcare. So we're paying 50% more than they spend for healthcare that is less adequate, that one way or another is coming out of all our pockets. $3 trillion per year coming out of the private sector into the healthcare sector, where the multiplier for it in the healthcare sector is not very high because lots of cream is getting skimmed off by the companies and the rich people who run the companies and who make exorbitant salaries. Okay. So, there's no question about it. The impact of this program would get rid of the health insurers, except for cosmetic services and rather odd things. They might be able to sell some there. But it would pretty much shut down the murderers by spreadsheet. They wouldn't be there anymore. Okay? And so consequently, we would cut down our costs from $3 trillion a year to roughly $2 trillion a year, coming out of the rest of our pockets. But that $2 trillion a year, if deficit spent, would produce, according to an econometric study done in 2007, I believe, by the California Nurses Association, now a division of National Nurses United, would produce a net gain of 2.5 million healthcare jobs. So that's a benefit to the economy, and it's also a benefit to each and every one of us because less money comes out of our pockets for healthcare. So it stays with us. We get to spend it. We get to spend it on high multiplier things rather than health insurance company executive salaries. Also, much more in line with public purpose than keeping the present insurance system in place. Okay, next, the infrastructure issue. My proposal is to fix it over 6 years. I want to spend $700 billion per year. Obviously, that's much more than either Trump or Sanders wanted to spend with their programs. Trump is calling for a $1 trillion program, and Sanders was calling for one the same size, but of course differently structured, with the spending structured in a much more effective way. Okay. But the key point here is that these figures of $1 trillion are way, way, way under what we need. The American Society for Civil Engineers estimated, I believe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that the total bill for fixing up the infrastructure of the United States and making it first rate again, as it was in the 1950s, would cost $3.6 trillion. Not $1 trillion, $3.6 trillion. Now, if you take into account likely inflation over the next few years and cost overruns over the next few years, I think you're looking at $4.2 trillion. 700B per year times 6 years, $4.2 trillion total to make our infrastructure first rate. The United States should have a world-class infrastructure. We should be second to none. Infrastructure is great for the economy. It's great for employment. It's great for people. $700 billion a year for that. Now, next, here we go with student loan and more. Create a free public educational system from preschool through graduate school. The existing system, everybody agrees, conservatives, liberals, everybody agrees that there are huge inefficiencies and quality problems in our existing system. The buildings, of course, we all know are in disrepair. That's a big, forever that's been the case. The teaching services, are inadequate. The teacher salaries don't compare to salaries in countries that have first-rate educational systems. I mean, our teacher salaries are probably half or even less than that of what they pay to teachers in Finland. This means our teachers are lower status people compared to other professionals, like accountants, doctors, and lawyers. If you go to other countries where the educational system is first rate, which ours isn't anymore, the teachers make much more. Their social status is far higher. They are valued as the teachers of the younger generation. In many cases, that's a big reason why these countries are happier places to live than the United States is these days. Because people get care. They get care when they're young. Opportunity is open to all through the educational system. We say we believe in equality of opportunity. There can't be equality of opportunity without equality of educational opportunity. We all know that. It's as obvious as the nose on your face. Most people don't have the money to spend on a first-rate private school education. They don't have the amount of money. Even if we paid people a living wage of $15 an hour, $15 an hour is $30,000 a year. How much do private schools cost in these days? I was hearing costs of $25,000 a couple of years ago when I was talking to some people about this. That if people didn't want to send their kids to a public school, they had to send them to a private school in D.C. because the public schools are so bad. $25,000. We want job guarantee people and job guarantee parents to be able to send their kids to a school where the educational system is first rate. This can be done. We can afford it. It's one of the most important things that we can afford and ought to do. And it probably could be funded for little more than government spending on education at all levels, state, federal, and local right now, if we got rid of the inefficiencies. I don't have the time to try to prove that in this particular talk, but I think there are a lot of people who agree with that statement, who are experts on the educational system. It is extremely inefficient. Now, student loan debt. The big elephant in the room. I want to get rid of student loan debt. I want the federal government to buy all the $1.2 trillion in student loan debt from the banks that are currently holding the debt. Pay them the money they lent out. Pay them a decent return on their loans. That doesn't mean the exorbitant loan returns they're getting now, but a decent return on their loans. And then, once the government owns the debt, I wanted to forgive each and every one of these debts. No more student loan debts. Students who have gone through the educational system are the greatest asset to this country we have right now. They mortgage themselves to get through it. They've paid out a lot, and they've repaid a lot. And I agree with the caller who said they need incentives to start to build a life. They do. And what they need is, especially, is that great burden of these unpayable student loan debts to be lifted from them. There's a friend of mine who's a professor. I won't say where. His brother graduated from school, his younger brother, with huge student loan debts. And for various reasons, reasons of illness, reasons of working on public service jobs, which are fairly low-paying jobs, for lots of reasons beyond his control, he's getting to a fairly advanced age, and those student loan debts are still hanging over his head. He's never been able to repay them. They have literally ruined his life. I know this is happening time and again in the United States. We have to get the usurers out of the student financing system. And we have to create a system of public finance here. And the first step is a debt jubilee for these students. Debts that cannot be paid will not be paid. That's a first principle, of economics. It's been recognized since the Babylonians. Why are we so stupid that we're unable to recognize it in these days? Okay, now here comes a real killer. Reinventing energy foundations and protecting the environment. Michael Hexter, a colleague of mine at the New Economic Perspectives blog, wrote not too long ago a series outlining a long-term program budgeting $4 to $6 trillion per year for greening the whole economy of the United States over a period of 10 to 20 years. Very, very ambitious program. It can be funded by the government because there are no funding limitations, as we know. But there could be inflation objections. But this is hard to figure out to some extent. The reason why it's hard to figure out is because, for example, when we get into things like personnel costs, things like that, if we already have a Medicare for All program, that cuts the bill for this particular program because no medical care benefits would have to be paid out as part of this particular program. We spend lots of money now on unemployment insurance. But with this program going on, there would be almost no unemployment payouts because this is so heavy with employment opportunities that we would have pretty close to full employment right along, and what it didn't absorb would be absorbed by the job guarantee program. No problem. There are other benefits which the federal government is paying out now, which it would no longer have to pay out because of the mere existence of this particular program. So this program would be sucking other federal expenditures out of the federal budget. Okay, so it isn't easy to evaluate the full impact of the federal budget onto this program. In other words, adding another $4 trillion per year. Okay, but it's likely, even when we take account of all of this, that a program like this would still be inflationary. So the question is, what do we do about that? Because if we don't have a modicum of price stability when we're going forward with this particular program, no matter how effective it is, and no matter how important it is, if it's going to trigger runaway inflation, then the legitimacy of the whole program and the federal government will be damaged and will create an unsustainable situation where we cannot finish this particular program. Because runaway inflation sabotages everything by removing legitimacy from the government so that it can't fulfill its functions. Fiscal sustainability may not depend on solvency considerations, but it is constrained both by inflationary considerations and by legitimacy considerations for the government. You can't have the kinds of inflations you have in Weimar or Zimbabwe or these other places. You can't have a legitimate government when you have this kind of inflation going on. So we need a modicum of price stability. How do we get that? Well, we know how to get that. It ain't fun, but we know how to get it. The reason why we know is because we got it in World War II. We put in rigorous cost, price, wage controls on things in World War I so that we could direct our production to a particular purpose. That purpose being the defense effort, the war effort. Okay. And that war effort created full employment in the United States. It also created a backlog of demand that fueled the enormous expansion after 1945. So what I'm saying is, one way or another, we can thwart inflation and we can fund this particular program. What we have to evaluate is how important survival is to us. Because, survival as a species, survival as a civilization. Because it's quite clear to anybody who looks at the science involved here that we are running out of time. Since Jimmy Carter tried to grapple with this during the 1970s, with some of the most ambitious programs yet started, but which were not continued, and which were too small anyway. We have literally wasted the years since then on doing anything about the predicted climate problems. They were predicted back then, 50 years ago. We have frittered away literally 50 years and made our task much, much harder than it was then. So we have to decide now, are we really serious about going through something that will end the climate crisis? that will save our civilization, save our grandchildren, save our great-children, or are we not? Are we just saying to ourselves, après-moi le déluge?
Breaking it out there, Joe.
Are we fiddling while Rome is burning? Okay, the basic income guarantee, the big. Okay, I suggested $15 an hour for the job guarantee. Okay, I meant to put in, I confused myself, okay, when I was going through here. Okay, I meant to consider the $8 an hour as a minimum basic income for the United States in the CPI, which is the cheapest in the whole country, and that would be cost adjusted upward. So that $8 an hour should actually compare to the $12 an hour, which I specified for the job guarantee program, not with the $15 an hour. The correct figure for comparison with the $15 an hour would be $10 an hour here, as opposed to $8 an hour. Okay, so keep in mind that I made that particular mistake. Okay, but okay, so let's use the $10 per hour basic income guarantee figure. That is 50% less than the figure for the JG at $15 an hour. Okay, I specified it as 50% less, or 2/3 of the amount of the job guarantee, because I wanted to leave the job guarantee as an anchor for the labor market economy. Okay, and I didn't want the basic income guarantee, okay, as interfering with the dynamics of that. So I figure the $5 an hour there, okay, is enough room to ensure that the greater incentive to work, that's the extra $5 an hour, doesn't make it so attractive to sit home that a very large number of people decides to sit home, reducing the productive capacity, okay, of our economy. I consider the basic income guarantee as useful for people who prefer to work at things that others don't find to be socially valuable, and for people who cannot work. Now, what I mean by that is, if you think back to the job guarantee, you'll remember that there I said that the local governments, the people participating in the program, and community nonprofits would form a process to decide which endeavors were socially valuable and which endeavors were not. And then they would get the job guarantee money to employ people to do those things. Well, what about someone who can't find a place in these activities to participate in because he or she wants to do something that others don't find to be socially valuable? Now, one thing we know about communities of people, okay, in general, and societies in general, is that what they find to be socially valuable can be at times short-sighted, okay, and in error when looked at according to historical perspective. Sometimes the lone individuals or the people who can't find enough people to form a group activity are right about the importance of what they are interested in. And if they're willing to go off on their own and to do something completely unapproved by others. It seems to me that a civilized society should give them that right and at least support them at a subsistence level. So I'm saying the $10 an hour, cost adjusted for all the regions of the country, would be much higher in New York City, say, for example. Okay, is not something that's fully a living wage, yes, but it recognizes their right to exist and to subsist. And determined people will be able to do that on the $10 an hour. And occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, one or more of them will produce some things that in retrospect look to be very socially valuable, which were unrecognized at the time of the original consideration. So I look at the basic income guarantee, okay, as a way of compensating for the errors groups make in deciding what is socially valuable and what is not. Sometimes the individuals are right and the groups are wrong. And we want to give that kind of scenario a chance to play out. And I think this gives them a chance to play out. I also think it's a useful supplement for Social Security. In other words, let's say people approve everything we said about Social Security, but they don't want to double the Social Security payment because they just think, these lazy old people are getting too much already. Well, then maybe the old people could still get a lot more by having a basic income guarantee supplement to help them out. I don't see anything wrong with that. Okay. I've already talked about the lone wolves sometimes being right, so I'm not going to repeat that anymore. I'm saying there's a right to subsist for those who don't want to contribute to the economy in a way that others consider as valuable. In other words, who just want to contribute as consumers. Okay. I think they have a right to live. And that's what I'm trying to provide for here. Okay, what are the disadvantages of the basic income guarantee? Well, that could raise the price of goods somewhat. It could have something of an inflationary effect. But since it's $5 an hour lower than the job guarantee, it's unlikely to have too much effect on inflation, I think, at that particular level. But the more important problem is that the basic income guarantee doesn't solve structural problems in the economy because it doesn't spawn new kinds of activity. It doesn't provide for reorganization of the productive structure in the economy. And that's a well-known kind of MMT objection, to the basic income guarantee, which I think is right on the mark. Now, in spite of that, I'm in favor of the basic income guarantee because basically what I'm proposing here as part of the agenda is implementing a job and income guarantee, or a JIG, which I talked about last time. So, the final item in the agenda, this is a very wide-ranging fiscal policy agenda. Okay. The crash of 2007 and 2008 created a housing crisis in the United States. Many people were foreclosed upon. Many houses fell into disrepair. There were many fraudulent activities that occurred in the foreclosure. Okay, what I want to do is to create some justice for what happened and some compensation for what happened. Can't do everything, of course, but I think we can do a lot. First, we could go back there and we could study and also continue on up to the present. We could investigate and monitor the big banks for fraud, okay, and do very thoroughgoing investigations of them. There are too many reports of fraud, particularly mortgage fraud, to ignore. There's a great deal of evidence on this particular score. Okay, to some extent, it received, the notice of the Obama administration, and the banks paid fines for some of the abuses. No executives went to jail. The fines were a mere slap on the wrist and meant nothing in relation to the kind of financial support which the banks were being given at the same time by the federal government in other parts of their bank recovery program. The recovery from the crash of 2008 was more a bank and Wall Street recovery than anything else. If they were to investigate everything, they would find all kinds of fraud, all kinds of grounds to prosecute people on. And they would also find that the banks on paper may now still be insolvent if they were forced to look at them in terms of their market value at present. I don't mean their stock market value, I mean their actual market value. So, if insolvency is found, or major fraud was committed by the banks, then I think the penalty should be taking them into resolution and have them taken over by the government. I further think that the banks, once taken over by the federal government and owned by the federal government, should then take write-downs on mortgage principals, more debt jubilee. The credit card interest rates on the mortgages that remain should be provided at a few points above the prime interest rate, not far from the rates that some of these people had paid, far from the rates that they pay now on their credit cards. Okay. If the other measure to pass a Medicare for All bill is not passed, then I suggest you can look at it from the standpoint of ending the housing crisis. Because once you pass an enhanced Medicare for All bill, many of the health insurance companies will end up in a bankruptcy state, and then they too could be taken over by the government, and the government would be in a position to cancel the debts owed by consumers to the health insurance companies, which have treated them unjustly for years and years, and which in many cases have forced consumers to foreclose on their houses, to give up their houses, and to go into bankruptcy. I think the federal government should then pay any remaining debts to the providers to get them out of the situation for good, talking about the health insurance company providers. that it then should compensate the homeowners who were victimized by the mortgage companies and by the banks for the equity they lost in their foreclosures. People lost a lot of equity during that period. And they lost it because the banks, in many cases, illegally foreclosed on the homeowners. The way they did it is that they robo-signed various papers, forging evidence, of mortgage debt and forging titles. They actually forged titles. They took those titles to court and used them to get the judges to issue the foreclosure orders. This happened in the United States. By the millions it happened. These people have never had to make that good. Many homes are still vacant. Where they are vacant, the previous owners should be allowed to take them back, and the government should provide grants to them for fixing up the homes the big banks have allowed to deteriorate. Because in many cases, the mortgage companies who affected the foreclosures have sat on the homes to keep them off the market, so they wouldn't be a glut on the market, and they just allowed these homes to deteriorate. And the housing stock has to be brought up to par. So let the homeowners themselves do it with grants from the government. Next, pay the previous owners of illegally foreclosed and no longer vacant homes. Pay them compensation for the wrongs that were done to them. This particular debt jubilee takes into account wholesale mortgage fraud. In investigating the facts behind the mortgage frauds, it also lays the groundwork for getting the people who committed these frauds to pay for it, to pay for their frauds through appropriate legal penalties. Now, I know there will be a battle royale over this. It will be very, very hard to get it through. The other things I've suggested here may be easier to get through. I won't even try to get this through without having built up a lot of social and political credit with the people of the United States first, so that they're willing to endure all the conflict it will take to pass this. But I feel strongly that we have to right the wrongs that were done to homeowners during this period of time, just as we have to right the wrongs that were done to students during this particular time by our neoliberal political economic system. And I think something like this program is a way to do it. It's a tough program, and it's going to encounter fierce opposition. But eventually, we will have to turn to it and bring justice to all those people who haven't gotten it. So that's my program. Now the big question arises, okay? I bet you never heard a lot of that, right?
Most of this stuff is fresh to most of these people, Joe. I sit there watching Ellis. Ellis is dueling with one of the infiltrators that's trying to debunk modern monetary theory as we're talking through this, which is always a bit humorous. But
as soon as we get off, I'm going to go look at that.
It's a positive money person. It's another one of these greening the dollar Zarlengas. So,
yeah, Zarlenga person, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, how much policy space do we have to deficit spend? Well, actually, that's a moving target. GDP in 2016 was $18.56 trillion. I just looked it up today. Okay, so that's relevant. An understanding of the sectoral balances is also relevant. Okay, and an understanding of how the sectoral balances relate to GDP growth is also relevant. In addition, you have to consider fiscal multipliers, because fiscal multipliers are important. But where I start is by looking at the idea of running a fiscal policy while accommodating the savings desires of the U.S. population and also accommodating the foreign import desires of the U.S. population. We can get pretty good estimates of what those are, because we've had imports, we've had the foreign sector balance rise in certain years to plus 6% in favor of the foreign sector. In other words, a trade deficit of 6%, of GDP. So we know that people can want foreign goods to the tune of a trade deficit of 6%. We know also from looking at sectoral balance data, in previous years, that when the private sector saves a healthy amount each year when it's looking to recover from a recession, it will want to save at least 6%, of GDP. That is, the private sector will want to save at least 6%, of GDP. So it will want to have a surplus of plus 6%. It wants to import goods to the extent that the foreign sector will have a surplus of plus 6%. That's 12%. For the sectoral balance equation to balance out, because remember, the three sectors have to be equal to 0, that means the federal government, to compensate for those leakages, will have to have a deficit that is 12% of GDP. Well, right now, roughly $2.2 trillion if it wanted to follow that very rational policy of accommodating the savers and the people who want to import goods. 12%, of GDP. How much is that right now? $2.2 trillion in rough terms. Okay. What's our federal deficit right now? Well, it's only $0.6 trillion, $600 billion. So we have a federal deficit spending shortfall right now today of $1.6 trillion. Okay? Now, one will note, of course, that all these things I put forward here will cost more than an additional $1.6 trillion per year. However, we can also note, the following. Much of the deficit that we're spending now, we're spending on things that will be replaced by my programs. So we'll have to make up for that deficit spending anyway. In other words, deficit spending that's caused by current unemployment programs, or by current expenditures, that benefit people, in various ways, will be replaced by the programs I specified here. So I won't need to spend money on those. So we're going to have more than the 1.6 T of room, in additional spending. I don't know how much more. Maybe 1.8 T or 1.9 T. But we can probably take care in the first year of the job guarantee program, the Social Security payroll tax, the state revenue sharing program, and the Medicare for All program, all as deficit spending. Now, let's say that we're adding the 1.6T. I don't want to confuse things too much here. So let's say we're adding the 1.6T, okay, in deficit spending on those things and maybe some others. So that goes into the economy. All the things we're spending on are pretty high multiplier things. Let's say the primary multiplier averages 1.5, and all the multipliers together total up to about 2.5 of the federal expenditure, okay, in GDP. That's going to mean that the 1.6T in GDP we're directly adding to the economy, okay, is going to come up to something like, what, 3.8 trillion in increased the GDP when all the multipliers are done. That's the first year. Okay? So now we're adding to the 18.56 something like 3.8 trillion. Suddenly, our GDP is now at 22 trillion. In the following year, we still have to deficit spend the 12 trillion. I'm sorry, the 12%, okay, of GDP. That has to continue each year. But now, the 12% comes to something like what? Instead of 2.2 trillion, it might come to 2.8 trillion. And instead of having room of 1.6 trillion, now we might have room of 2.2 trillion beyond the normal deficits that we see now, or what we consider, okay, the normal deficits. Okay, my point here is that each year, the absolute amount of policy space room we have may remain the same as a percentage, okay, of GDP, but each year it increases in absolute numbers. And we are better able to afford more and more money for expensive programs like Michael Hexter's program. And some of the other programs. I haven't computed all this out, but it's quite clear that after about 2 or 3 years of this, we're up to having, I don't know, 3 to 3.5 trillion in additional room after the normal deficit spending.
That's a lot of policy space there, sir.
That's a lot of policy space, and that increases every year as the GDP continues to grow, because remember, now it's growing at its full potential. We're not allowing any fiscal drag. We're targeting full employment. We're targeting full demand from consumers. We're targeting growth.
I want to be fair to you. We're approaching the 2-hour mark here. We got 7 minutes till 10.
Okay.
I just want to kind of give you a chance to wrap it up so that everybody can get a bow on this, because I think this is incredible. And I think everybody learned an incredible amount of what it means to actually assess the economy and not just say things, but actually assess the different triggers, the different aspects of stabilizers, and what it means to have a fiscal policy, not just a social policy, but the fiscal space to back up that social policy. So go ahead and close us out, Joe. I want to give you the floor here.
Okay, I'm going to close it out in the following way. We want to continue here to pay close attention to the economics, okay, of MMT. That is the economic principles, okay, of MMT, the truths of MMT, and we want to contrast them with the myths that are being propounded by the neoliberal approach, by the neoliberal economists. We want to continue to point out where they're wrong and why they are wrong. We want to continue to increase understanding of things like the sectoral balances. We want to continue to explore the way that our domestic fiscal policies relate to our trading policies and our trading agreements and the details of trade agreements. All these things are very important. But what's also important is the application of MMT thinking and MMT principles to policy issues and to public purpose. And the way we get to do that is by being clear about what we mean by public purpose and all the aspects or dimensions, okay, of public purpose, and then developing policy agendas based on public purpose, and then beginning to hash out these policy agendas. Like, for example, with respect to the one I did here, I am sure that I've forgotten some things that other people have great policies that they will want to offer that are very important in the fiscal policy area and that supplement what I had to say about fiscal policy over here. That's all to the good. We want to take a look, okay, at this agenda. We want to critique it. We want to improve it. We want to expand it. And we want to be clear on its overall relation to public purpose. Because the agenda should form the core of how we're going to, of where we're going to stand when we want to negotiate with others and come to agreement with others and expand our coalition and begin to do concrete things to achieve economic and social justice. The only way we can really do this is get into the specifics, okay, of policy and take all the criticisms and consider them, okay, and answer them, change where we have to change. But this is also very hard work. MMT is very hard work. It's hard to get the understanding of the paradigm. It takes time. It takes reading. It takes effort. But also very important is the nitty-gritty of these policy agenda things and how they're going to work. If we're going to get these accepted, we have to be as wonky as the neoliberal fools. We really do. We have to get in there, and we have to know every wonky wrinkle and how it relates to our underlying principles and our underlying idea of public purpose. So that's the way I'd end it.
Thank you, sir. That was fantastic. I mean, my goodness. So, Joe, with that, talk to us. One last thing. What are we talking about next week, man?
Okay. What did I say we were talking about next week? I suggested it before to you, and right now it's a blank in my mind because
that's okay.
So focused on this.
I wanted to put. I'm gonna tell you right now. I just wanted to tell you. So, we're sketching out the networks in Washington D.C. that day in and day out reinforce austerity ideology and policies that oppose real fiscal responsibility and progressive fiscal policy agenda. That's
right.
where we're going.
That is what I had in mind. And the reason why I thought that was so important was, as I said, it's great to focus on the aspects of MMT and getting to an understanding of the paradigm. It's also great to focus on these policy agendas. But we also have to know who our opposition is and what they like and what they think and what the basis of their power is. It is, of course, we know money affects things in all kinds of ways. But if we're going to beat it, we have to know the details of how it's affecting things, how it works through social and political networks, how it co-ops people here, people there, people in various parts of the Democratic Party, how the elites in Washington meet to form their overall consensus on what kind of policy is good policy and what kind of policy is responsible policies, how they interact with the money, and how they interact with the lobby groups that represent the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and how they interact with the lobby groups that represent the center part of the Democratic Party and part of the Republican Party, and how they interact with the right and with their interest groups. This is one big socio-political network, okay, in Washington and New York. It's not as big as the total network in the whole country, but it's at the center of political power, of the day-to-day political struggle. And getting to know that network and who the main figures on it, in it are extremely important, because some of these figures are relatively shadowy. I mean, it's not a matter of just saying, oh, the Koch brothers is funding. Oh, Sheldon Adelson gave a $600 million contribution to the Trump campaign. I mean, Sheldon Adelson is not fooling around in Washington every single day, occupying people's minds. Okay? He's not engaged in doing that. Okay? He may provide a lot of the money to do that, but he's not himself doing that. And the Koch brothers are not themselves doing that also. They're more focused. They're somewhat focused here in D.C., but they're also focused on state legislatures all over the country through ALEC. Okay? So those connections are very important too. But what I'll be focusing on here next week is I'll be focusing on the connections here in Washington to financial power in Washington and in New York.
Very good, sir. All right. So with that, folks, I'm going to give Jolton Joe Firestone. I'm going to give Joe his night back to him, his family. And you all, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was long and it was very powerful. Watch it in segments, rewatch it again, learn these things, make yourself ask new questions, and then come back ready for more. We'll try our best to fit in questions throughout the interviews going forward, because you guys we want to make sure you're equipped to be able to fight this war with us as well. So with that, Joe, thank you so much again, sir. Have a great night.
Bye.
We're out of here.
Yeah, take care.